Hello. So today, as part of the Seed to Table initiative with Calgary Horticultural Society, I'm going to be sharing with you guys how to water bath can and what exactly water bath canning is. So for those of you who don't already know me, I'm Krista Green. I love to garden, I love to preserve, and I love to be able to feed my family with food that I have grown. Part of growing food, especially in this Calgary area where we have very long winters, is finding ways to make that food last through the winter and last as long as we can. I also love being able to stretch food out over 2 years because I often find I have years where things don't work as well. So last year was not a great tomato year for me. The year before was amazing. And I was able to can a bunch of tomatoes so that even this year, I am still able to be using tomato sauce and diced tomatoes that I was able to can myself. So, water bath canning, let's look at what some of the benefits of water bath canning are. So first of all, water bath canning is called this as opposed to pressure canning. I'm sure you guys have heard of pressure cookers and you understand the idea of how those work. Water bath canning means putting jars, immersing jars in boiling water. So that's why we call it the water bath. And some of the benefits of using water bath canning are that it doesn't require any electricity for storage. I love that I keep a lot of my canning out in the garage. And, if we have power outages, I'm just outside of the city. So if there is a power outage, I don't need to worry about my canning. It's shelf stable. I also love that it's ready for instant use. So I do also pressure can some things. So something like my pressure canned stew, I can open that up, heat it up, and we have dinner on the table in under 10 minutes. I also love how canning feels to me like a zero waste kind of thing. I have invested in some reusable lids, and as I'm sure you know, the jars are reusable as well. You do need to make sure when you're canning that you're using canning specific jars. So not all jars are rated to be boiled in hot water, and some of them could crack. So you want to make sure you're getting the Ball or Bernardian. Those are the two most popular brands, I would say, for canning. Invest in those quality jars. And once you have the jars and you have lids, you can use them over and over again. I will say about my reusable lids, I have had better success with the lids that are purposed for a one-time use. I've had a higher rate of seals on them. So things that I know I'm going to be using jars, say my salsa. I use a lot of salsa. So salsa, I'll use really reusable lids. And if 3 or 4 of my jars don't seal, I just put those ones in the fridge and they get used in the next couple months and they're perfectly good in the fridge for a while. I love how long you can keep food once it's canned. So tomatoes, as opposed to tomatoes in the fridge or on the counter or however you might be trying to keep them, once they're canned, a lot of canning is good for 2 years on the shelf. So depending on what is in that jar, some pickles maybe even longer because pickled items have such a high vinegar and salt content. Those ones can last for quite some time. Let's look at what equipment we need to can. When I started canning, I bought a Bernardian canning kit. And if you look at this picture in this photo, you see the rubber mat on my counter. And the rubber mat, the funnel, the jar lifter, some lids, some pectin. I think those were all included in this kit. I picked it up at Walmart for $20, I think. I already had a stock pot, also seen on the edge of this photo here, and it worked perfectly because this rubber mat was able to fit in the bottom of my stock pot. So you do need, as I mentioned, jars that are rated for canning. You do need lids, and when I say lids here, I'm talking about both the lid and the ring. You need a ring that's not all rusted, something in decent shape to be able to tighten the lid onto your jar. And then your pot needs to be deep enough that your jar will be submersed by 1 to 2 inches of water. So you do need a fairly big pot, a deep pot, to be able to can. It is important that the jars don't sit directly on the bottom of the pot, because if they are directly on the bottom of the pot, that heats up the bottom of the jar and your jar can crack. I have cracked jars more so with pressure canning. I don't think I've actually cracked any jars with water bath canning, which is a bonus for water bath canning. And a jar lifter. So I mentioned that was in my kit. The jar lifter is important. Some of the canning pots, they have a rack in them to lift your jars right out of the pot. But if you don't have that full rack to go inside your pot, the jar lifter is perfect because you can pull out your hot jars safely. You can also pull them out of the oven if they're quite hot safely. Might want to take note of this jar lifter, because I've heard from a few different people who said they were using their jar lifter backwards, and I could see how that would happen. So the one end of the jar lifter that's meant for lifting the jar, it's slightly curved to go around the edges of the jar. And then a canning funnel or a wide mouth funnel. It's not actually necessary. You could get by without it, but it does make filling your jars a lot cleaner and tidier with less spill. That, along with our water and our stove to heat up our water, that's really all you need to get started canning. I do recommend, if you are wanting to get into canning and you're wanting to can quite a few things, to invest in a quality recipe book. So the Bernardian and the Ball canning books, I know that all the recipes in these books have been university studied to be food safe. That makes me feel a lot more comfortable, especially when I was starting out. I was like, I don't want to make my family sick. Is following these recipes and knowing that the salt, if you use the salt content, the vinegar content, that helps get your pH correct and make sure your food is safe. I don't measure pH. I haven't measured pH in anything I've canned. I do follow recipes. Before you start, you're probably going to want to sterilize your equipment. Some people, I have heard the argument that it should get sterilized in the pot during that water bath, the boil time. But I prefer to start with knowing my things are sterilized, my jars are sterilized. And either way, because these jars are going to be going into hot water, it's really good to start with your jars warm and the brine or the contents warm so that nothing cracks when it goes into the pot. If you were to put a cold jar with cold contents into a hot pot, obviously you risk cracking that. So you want to start with clean jars. Sometimes they've been cleaned maybe a week before. I don't always re-clean them the day of, as long as they were clean. And then rinse the jars in warm water. My mom taught me this tip. There is concerns sometimes with repeatedly heating up jars in dry heat can break down the quality of the glass over time. Moisture helps maintain the integrity of the glass. If you rinse your jars with warm water and you put them in the oven for 15 minutes, so a note about this, if your oven is preheated, make sure you get your jars nice and warm in that warm water. Again, if we're putting cold jars into a warm oven and they're empty, there's that risk of cracking. A warm jar into a warm oven is safer. Or if you're rinsing them and they're not too warm, you can start with a cold oven and turn it on while the jars are in the oven. Sometimes I do also put a pot of water in with my jars just to add that little bit of extra moisture to keep the integrity of the glass. What I like to do with the rest of everything else I'll be using, my funnel, my ladles, the lids, is I like to boil those in water for 10 minutes. Generally, I do my lids separately, as seen in the photo here. It's a good idea if you stagger your lids a little bit. They tend to get stuck together, which can be a pain if you're using two different size lids. One tip is to put a small and then large and small and large so they don't stick together. And I put those in one pot, and then usually everything else I throw into my canning pot. So the big stock pot you see on the stove here, that would be my canning pot, and that holds Well, it's preheating, I should say, and I'm bringing it up to boiling, I have my funnel and all my other work tools in there. So now what? So now, we're sterilizing everything. We have something that we want to put in the jars. Now we need to find a reliable recipe from a reliable source. I highly suggest taking notes during this presentation. There's a few things I'm going to say that you might want to look back and might help you with your canning later. So again, the Bernardian or the Ball websites, you don't have to own the book. You can go to their websites and you can find recipes there. They will also help you. They will say if it needs to be pressure canned or water bath canning, or sometimes there's options for both. So things that can't be water bath canned safely are things that need to heat up past a point of boiling. Those foods include meat, beans, corns, any low acid foods really. Those ones are supposed to be pressure canned. The higher acid foods, so anything pickled is going to be higher acid because you have that vinegar in there that brings the acidity up. Tomatoes, although tomato recipes, if you're water bath canning, usually they'll instruct you to add some lemon juice in to bring up the acidity. And jams and jellies, those are generally safe for canning. We'll talk a little bit more about them later on. So yeah, have your produce, make sure it's somewhat clean, chop it up into the size you want it to be, and find your recipe. For Calgary, you need to know that we have to adjust the time on the recipe. Again, the benefit of having a book is it discusses this. There's, that bit in the front or the back that tells you these tips, but that's why you're watching today too, to find these tips. So Calgary is at over 3,000 feet. And what you need to know is that between 3,000 and 6,000 feet, you have to add 10 minutes of boiling time to any recipe, any water bath canning recipe. The reason for this is that water boils at a lower temperature at higher elevations. So for those reasons, to kill the same amount of bacteria and microorganisms, you have to boil it a little bit longer. So the 10 minutes of extra time. All right, so kind of a recap of some of the things here and the canning steps. I have not covered all the steps, so some of this is new and some of it is recap. And again, I highly suggest that you take notes through this because we're going to go through some details here. So sterilizing our equipment, we talked about. And then the next thing is when you fill the jars, you want to use hot brine or hot content. For your jams and jellies, there's no brine, it's just your jelly and your jam. And you want to have the jar hot and the content hot. If your jar is cold and your jelly's boiling, you're going to break your jar. If the other way around, your jar is hot, but you let your jelly get cold, which wouldn't really work because it would start to set, then you could break your jar. So I guess where this more comes into play is peaches. I love to can peaches. My family loves canned peaches, and every year for Christmas we have crepes with home canned peaches. The peaches are generally room temperature. When I go to can them, box has been sitting out on the counter. The brine that you would make for peaches is going to be a sugar brine. And the sugar is important in recipes because sugar is a preservative. So if you are following a university recipe, just know that if you decrease the sugar amount, it can change the shelf life and the preserving quality of the recipe. So the sugar water is going to be your brine for peaches, and I bring it up to a boil and I keep it really hot. And then I take my jar out of the oven. So maybe I've turned the oven off if it's already done the 15 minutes at 180. I'll pull the jar out, I'll set it on a hot pad of some sort, and then, important to note, start with about an inch of the hot brine in the bottom of the jar before you add your content. So as we're talking about peaches here, I'm going to do an inch of my hot brine, then I'm going to add my peaches. If I was to add my room temperature peaches to the hot jar, again, could crack the jar. And then you top off, once you fill it with peaches, you top it off with brine, and you top it off to whatever your recipe says headspace you need. So the headspace is the space in the top of the jar that is not filled with produce. It just has the air in the top. So most recipes are around ½ inch of headspace. Some of them might be up to an inch or as little as a 1/4 inch. I think jams and jellies have a less headspace on them. Anyways, so you fill that up and then you're going to wipe the rim of the jar. So in the second picture in here, you can see I'm wiping the rim of a jar with a cloth. So this is a clean microfiber cloth. It doesn't have to be a special cloth, but you do want to make sure it's really clean. Sometimes you can dip that into some vinegar water or just water to get it damp. You can use paper towel to wipe the rims of your jar. And what you're doing when you wipe the rim is you're ensuring that there's no food particles or salt particles that are going to prevent the seal from forming in that jar. So our jar rings, I'm just going to go back to the photo that I had. Here you'll see that photo of the jar lids. They have a rubber seal of some sort on each lid, and most jar lids are recommended that you only use once. You want to make sure that there's no big dents or cracks in those rubber seals. It's important that that rubber seal is intact because that's what's going to help your jar seal correctly. Once you've wiped the rims, you set that jar lid on top of your jar. I didn't put it as a step here. It is a step. Sometimes these seem intuitive and it's hard to remember to write it down. Anyways, you set that, and I usually use tongs because I don't want to get any grease from my hands or anything from my hands. Also, I have to pull it out of the hot water and set that jar lid on the jar, and then you're going to tighten the ring just hand tight. You don't want to be cranking down as hard as you possibly can. It's meant so that sometimes a little bit of pressure can escape the jar, and that's okay. So yeah, you want it tight. I wouldn't stress too much if you're new to canning. Make it tight. I've never had a jar explode because I've tightened it too much, and I do tend to make mine fairly tight. If it's too loose, it might rattle a bit while it's boiling and the ring might become even looser. So if you're going to err on one side, I would err on a little bit too tight. But again, you're not cranking it down. You're just tightening it to hand tight. So you tighten that ring and then you're going to place your jar. You're going to lower it. So yeah, we filled the contents. We've cleaned the lid's on. And then in the fourth picture here, you can see I'm lowering the jar into the pot. So hopefully you can see this photo okay. And I also want to just note one thing that I do, I think I'm pickling beets here, is see the jar set on the outside of my canning pot. I do that because I don't want to end up boiling them for an extra 10 minutes because then food can become a little bit more mushy. So if you're working with, pickles, or in this case, pickled beets that I don't want them overcooked, I leave them on the outside of the canner on my stove where it's still warm, so they stay nice and warm, and I will safely be able to lower them into the boiling water. And that way I can lower them all down into the boiling water at the same time. Often, because your jars aren't boiling, it's going to cool your water down a little bit. And you're gonna, once your jars are all in the canner with that rubber mat of some sort or something on the base of the pot so they're not directly on the bottom, you have to bring the water back up to a boil before you start your timer. Once the water is back up to a boil, and again, making sure all the jars are covered by 1 to 2 inches of water at least, then you run your timer, you add that 10 minutes for altitude. So a lot of recipes are around 10 minutes. So for us in Calgary, it's going to be 20 minutes. Then you're going to pull them out carefully with your jar lifter, set them on something safe, and let them cool. It's recommended that you don't touch the jars for 24 hours. hopefully during that 24 hours, you're going to hear some pops, one of my favorite sound. If you've heard it, you know. If you know, you know, kind of thing. The popping of jar lids as they cool off, what happens is the jar lid suctions down the contents. They're expanded when they're hot, and then they contract when they cool, and it pulls the center of the jar lid, and that's your seal. That tells you that you're getting a good seal on your jar lid. So a note about seals, that popping sound or the indentation of jar lids can be an indicator that it has sealed, but it's good to double check your seals. There is such thing as a false seal. So sometimes the jar lid will concave, but it didn't get a true seal over time. It'll loosen off. The best way I have found to check for this is after the 24 hours. I loosen my jar rings. Often I will wash, and it is recommended that you wash the outside of your jars with soap because little bits of food and steam and things do escape and they become sticky. Anything on the outside of your jar can grow bacteria. So washing the outside of the jar before you put it away for storage is a good idea. And after I take the rings off, important to wait for that 24 hours, I tap the top of the lids. When you tap the lid just a couple times, listen to the sound, and as long as you're doing jars that are the same size, they should all sound the same. It's happened to me a few times since I've learned this tip that I'm going along tap, 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 tap. All of a sudden I get to one tap, tap, and it sounds quite different. And I know that one has a false seal. It's okay if all your jars don't seal, don't stress about it. Hopefully the percentage is less than 10. Just put those ones in the fridge and use them up first. Know that they won't store quite as long. I hope that this presentation on water bath canning is helping you feel confident and feel that it's easy and like it's something that you can do. Jams and jellies are super easy. I added them in here, even though a lot of them don't actually have to be water bath canned. They will seal by filling the jar with a hot jar with hot content. And it is important with jams and jellies that you're not water bath canning. It's very important to make sure you've sterilized those jars beforehand. And as the contents cools off, they will seal. One thing to know about jams and jellies, as I kind of mentioned earlier, sugar is a preservative. So for jams and jellies, you need to buy pectin for most of them. Pectin, don't cheap out, buy a name brand one. The Bernardian, I think, is what I have been using recently. And inside your pectin box, you can open it up ahead of time. You can open it up 6 months ahead of time. It's fine. There's often a pamphlet with recipes for the common jams and jellies. If you're following those recipes, again, those ones are food safe. But you can't alter the sugar levels without affecting how long, like the preservative qualities in there because of the sugar, and as well as the pectin and sugar interact. So if you alter your sugar levels, your jams and jellies might not set. So that's important to know, because if you're like me, you wish that you had a lot less sugar in your life. And I don't love using sugar, so I always want to decrease it in my recipes, but it's important that you understand the risks of doing so. I won't say that I've never done it myself, and sometimes I've had success and they've set really well anyways, but it is not something that I can recommend. So I just want to say thank you to the City of Calgary and this partnership that has enabled this Seed to Table initiative and teaching us all about growing food and preserving food, and that circle of we grow something, we use it, we compost, and there's no waste involved in that. I just love that. So thank you very much. I hope you've enjoyed this presentation, and I hope that you now feel excited and confident to go out canning.